Welcome to EV Hub Live, a live video podcast for professionals advancing transportation electrification. To find out more about the show, visit atlasevhub.com/live. On Wednesday, the EPA announced the final standards to regulate emissions from new passenger vehicles sold in the United States. The regulation is poised to transform the auto industry and could put the U.S. on a glide path to full electrification. On today's episode, we'll hear from Audrey LaForest from Automotive News and Chris Harto from Consumer Reports as they discuss the new rule. They'll cover the greater context driving the rule, what's in it, how the industry is responding, and what comes next. Here's your host, Atlas Public Policy's founder, Nick Nigro.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again to an episode of EV Hub Live. It was a historic week here in Washington as the EPA rolled out what amounts to be the most significant effort to reduce pollution from transportation in the country's history. We are looking at a rule that is going to affect Americans across the country and what kind of cars we buy over the next 5, 10, 15, even 20 years. The rule was finalized this week. It was a great little celebration here in Washington for a lot of people who worked very hard on it. And I'm very excited to be joined by two very sharp guests who know a lot about what's going on in the automotive world. Welcome to the show, Audrey and Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
All right, so let's jump right into it. Full disclosure, the three of us were actually in the room when the administrator was announcing the rule today. So we got a firsthand look at what it means. And I'd love to just start with a little bit of background from you both on what's in this rule. What are the goals? What are the incentives? What are the credits? And any other big picture things that you want to talk about. And we'll start with you, Audrey.
Yeah, so compared to what the EPA proposed back in April, this final rule definitely shows the EPA compromising with the auto industry. When the proposal came out, automakers, new car dealers, and the UAW all had pleaded with the EPA to relax some of the requirements, saying that as it was drafted, it was effectively a mandate and an aggressive, or an EV mandate and an aggressive increase in EV sales before things like the supply chains, infrastructure were ready, and the market were ready. This final rule that came out on Wednesday shows the EPA sort of easing some of those stringencies in the early model years and then really tightening those restrictions after the 2030 model year. So effectively giving the auto industry a little bit more time to ramp up EV sales, production, and giving the infrastructure more time, the charging infrastructure to come online and whatnot.
Yeah, we're showing the graphic here right now on what the final rule says. Chris, help us read this thing.
Yeah, sure. And just to be clear, these rules are technology neutral. They're in no way EV mandates. These numbers on the graph are really just projections of potential compliance pathways. Automakers can use a diversity of technologies, including improving the efficiency of gasoline vehicles, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and battery electric vehicles to meet these technology neutral performance standards, which really dictate how much tailpipe pollution, primarily greenhouse gases, but there's also rules for particulates and other criteria pollutants. So these are just EPA's projections of one possible compliance pathway, but it does show a fairly significant ramp of electrified vehicles over the course of the rule from 2027 through 2032.
And what's your take on what Audrey's saying about the difference between the draft rule and the final rule?
Yeah. There's definitely a weakening of the rule in those earlier years. There's a little bit of relaxing the top line stringency of the rule, and then there's a number of credit provisions that have been extended in the final rule that had been planned to be phased out. That give automakers a little bit extra credit for some stuff that they do, particularly on their gasoline vehicles.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one thing that, when I was reading some of the text, that jumped out at me is just, some of the ways that automakers are going to be able to comply. There's a standard for tailpipes. They can get credits through a variety of means. They in the text from EPA, they talk about hybrid vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, of course, all electric vehicles and conventional vehicles, all being part of that compliance. Now, how is a consumer supposed to understand what that means for them? What is the market going to look like 8 years from now? Is it going to is all of that just sort of window dressing? And the reality is it's going to all be all electric, or is it true that, from your take at least, that, we are going to see this mix of technologies over the next several years? Chris, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely going to see a growing mix of electrified vehicles, but it's definitely going to be a mix. Again, it'll be up. Different automakers will take different pathways. Some will go very heavy on conventional hybrids and plug-in hybrids. Some might, stick with, without improving their gasoline vehicles at all and just go all in on battery electric vehicles. So there's a lot of flexibility for automakers to choose different pathways. And, the short answer for consumers is they're going to have more choices in more vehicle classes of more types of vehicles that can save them money at the pump.
And Audrey, is this sort of what they were hoping to get out of this final rule? That I'm speaking about the industry right now, relative to what the draft rule said.
Yeah, I would say it's probably not their best case scenario. But, we heard from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation CEO, John Bozzella. He was at the event on Wednesday. They had put out a statement where he called it sort of on the ragged edge of achievable, and saying that, the industry is investing heavily in electrification, but there are challenges, and that the auto industry needs all these different pieces of the puzzle to go right, so for them to be able to ultimately, produce and sell more electric vehicles, including plug-in hybrids, and to comply with the rules. And, some of those challenges, as I said earlier, have to do with the EV charging, and also consumer demand. And that kind of gets into your question about, the consumer in all of this. And that's been sort of one of the things that I've seen the auto industry talk more about, is that all of this, sure, we have this regulation now, but all of this ultimately comes down to, what does the consumer want? What is the consumer buying? From my coverage that I've done, at Automotive News, we also cover new car dealers pretty heavily. So franchise dealers that are selling, cars from General Motors, Ford, and whatnot. They're sort of the group that's maybe less happy with what is in this final rule. They're saying that it is still too aggressive. They're the ones that are face to face with the consumers that are buying EVs. And they're saying that right now, at least, what this rule would require is far beyond what they're seeing in terms of consumer interest on their showrooms.
Yeah, that is, the dealers, certainly, I don't recall them being represented at the event. And they have been a bit, let's say, negative about EVs to date. I'd love to understand both of your perspectives on, from the industry side of things. What does this rule actually mean for autos in their industry, particularly here in the United States, and what does it mean for EVs? Chris, go ahead.
Yeah. And just to put some context into what some of those numbers on the first graph you had up there mean in terms of actual consumers having these vehicles in their hands, in their driveways. We hear a lot about the numbers on the new sales side, but ultimately what matters is how many of these vehicles end up in the hands of consumers. And we've done some initial analysis of this rule, and I estimate that around 11% of Americans will be able to own a battery electric vehicle by 2030, and about 16% of Americans, there'll be enough EVs produced so that about 16% of Americans can own an electric vehicle in 2032, but by the end of 2032, at the end of this rule. And that compares to about a third of Americans who tell us in our surveys that they would seriously consider a battery electric vehicle today. I think these rules are pretty in line, if somewhat conservative, in terms of where we kind of see the consumer market going for these vehicles.
Yeah, that's what's the context you just provided there about new sales versus what we would say vehicles on the road. Obviously a small fraction of people buy new vehicles, and it's always good to put this kind of thing in perspective, because all of the attention tends to be on sales.
When people see a graph like the one you put up, they see 69%. Like 69% of Americans have to have a plug-in vehicle by 2032. That's impossible. And it is impossible. And that's not what these rules do. It's a fairly slow, gradual process of getting those vehicles into the hands of consumers.
So Audrey, would the car companies agree with Chris? This is a very slow, gradual progress.
I would say probably not. They might. I don't want to speak for them, but they might have a different perspective in terms of the challenges that they're still faced with. I mean, I'll just point to General Motors. With them sort of adjusting their production plans even before this rule was finalized. I think, just seeing what was required or would have been required in the proposed rule from April was kind of a signal to the auto industry of where the Biden administration was heading with all of this. But, we saw General Motors, actually talk about, offering more plug-in hybrids. We've seen Ford talk about offering their customers more alternatives to just a battery electric vehicle. We've seen other automakers, I believe it was Mercedes-Benz, I think globally, adjust their EV sales targets. So you're kind of seeing, I don't want to say that the industry is pulling back from their from the automakers that have committed to an EV only future, but they're adjusting sort of the timeline, the time frame that it'll take to get there. And I think too, going back to, I think something that Chris was talking about, and maybe something that was laid out in the chart that you talked about, the EPA in the final rule does lay out these, I think there's 3 pathways for what they see vehicle technology penetration rates would look like for new vehicles under these rules. In 2 scenarios, there's more plug-in hybrids, there's more hybrids. In another scenario, it's battery electric heavy. And even in the battery electric heavy scenario that the EPA projects, 29% of new vehicles would be internal combustion engine vehicles in the 2032 model year. So I think that also shows, it's these types of technologies options aren't going away. And we'll also kind of see, I guess, as the years go by, how the industry ultimately decides to comply with these rules.
Chris, I want to pick up something that Audrey said about the plug-in hybrid thing, because that has been, catching a lot more news lately than it had in previous years. I would say probably for most of the last 3 years, the lion's share of attention, particularly in the media, has been on the rise of battery electric vehicles. They make up the vast majority of EV sales in the US now. But what we're seeing is, as Audrey pointed out, an increased number of announcements related to plug-in hybrids. Is that just synced with the timing of this rule? Is that a coincidence? Is that something that we should expect to see more of? Is this a blip where plug-in hybrids will be around for another couple of years and they'll disappear, or what? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I think a big part of it is the tax credits, the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits apply to plug-in hybrids as well. So that can, in many cases, bring the cost of a plug-in hybrid down, about the same price as a similar gasoline vehicle in many cases. So as long as those tax credits are in place, I think we could see quite a few new plug-in hybrid options. I think those vehicles work especially well in certain segments. Really interested to see the Ram Rev pickup truck coming from Stellantis. That's a vehicle with 100 miles of electric range, but a gasoline engine as a generator to for when you're going long distances, when you're towing, especially for rural consumers who may not have as much access to public charging infrastructure. They probably have a place to charge at home, but I think there's a strong niche, at least a significant niche where those plug-in hybrids really work well for a lot of consumers. But I also think a lot of consumers will kind of use them as a stepping stone, get a plug-in hybrid over the next few years, live with that, learn what it's like to plug in a vehicle, to run on electricity, to not have to go to the gas station, and then realize how infrequently they're going to the gas station, and decide that they're the next car they want. They
There's
can go
one
all electric.
important facet of what you just talked about that I was hoping you could explain a little bit more. There have been plug-in hybrids that have been out there. I won't say the automaker, but they only had 10 miles of range or 15 miles of range. There's still some out there that only have 20. And there's a fair amount of data that show people who have that kind of range aren't really plugging in very often. And so does this rule do it right when it comes to encouraging effectively electric miles traveled, which is the goal of a plug-in hybrid?
Yeah, I can speak to a little bit of that. The rule probably overcredits plug-in hybrids a little bit. EPA decided to keep their original calculation for how plug-in hybrids count towards the rule, which was based on some older data. It was kind of theoretical modeling rather than real world data. Some of the real world data is showing that, on average, people plug in a little bit, maybe 10, 20% less than the, kind of ideal model would say. So there's a little bit of benefit to automakers by that, the way that they're currently, factoring that in. But EPA did say they're planning to reconsider that before the end of this rule, and potentially lower that compliance value. But yeah, the value of plug-in hybrids depends entirely on how often consumers plug them in. And the California zero emission vehicle standards, starting in 2026, will require about 50 miles of range for those plug-in hybrids to count to get full credit for the ZEV standard. So I think we're going to see some regulatory pressure that's going to be pushing towards some more longer, more useful range for those plug-in hybrids that will hopefully give consumers more of an incentive to plug them in.
Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about what's down the road. It's not that common in my experience for rules like this to happen in an election year. There's a lot at stake. A lot of eyeballs are on what the government's doing in an election year. And to some extent, I think by finalizing a rule in this way in the middle of a campaign, that's a signal from the Biden administration that they want eyes on this. They want people to know what's being done and effectively to try to run on this, among other things, of course. If presumptive nominee former President Trump wins, he's talked pretty badly about electric vehicles in the last several months, and it's not clear, what this rule would look like in his administration. He already demonstrated in the first time he was president that, he would temper the enthusiasm of reducing emissions with the rule that EPA finalized then. What can we expect to happen if, President Trump becomes the president again? Audrey, what's your take?
Yeah, so, there's been a lot of chatter since the final rule was put out on Wednesday, and a lot of chatter that I've heard regarding this word durable. So ensuring that the rule is durable. I think that can probably be taken in a number of ways, but one of the first things that popped into my head when I had quite a few sources saying that word was just how badly the EPA needed the auto industry's support behind this rule as sort of reinforcement if and when there is a legal challenge, or if the Trump administration tries to drastically roll back the standards. In the last Trump administration, like you said, Nick, we did see EPA and NHTSA standards rolled back. I think it's highly likely that we'd see that again under a second Trump presidency. We brought up California too. I think we could also potentially see their Clean Air Act waiver revoked again. So for the auto industry, in terms of, regulatory certainty, all of those things, sort of this pace of the EV transition here in the US, a lot's at stake in November.
Chris, anything you want to add on that one?
Yeah, just that there are, processes that these things have to go through. So just like it's taken the Biden administration, over 3 years to get to this point and finalize these rules, it took the Trump administration about until, early 2020 to roll back the rules in, his first administration. So these process, there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through to do this correctly, and as Audrey said, in a legally durable way. So even in a different administration, these rules probably would stay in place for a number of years. But yeah, the industry, I think, really wants some certainty. And yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you hit the key word there, certainty. What we've seen in the last few years is a considerable ramp up in investments in EVs and infrastructure. We've calculated it here to be over $175 billion have been cumulatively announced in EV manufacturing in the United States. And, from the graph, you can see the lion's share of that since the Biden administration began with the passage or enactment of IIJA infrastructure law and in the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's a lot of money now flowing into manufacturing electric vehicles, clean vehicles, batteries, et cetera. These companies need to earn a return. And so there is to some extent, there is a bit of a point of no return on that. And so, Audrey, do you think that that's in part why we're seeing, so much, I don't want to call it enthusiasm from the industry for this rule, but acceptance of it? Is it in part because the sort of ship has already sailed for them and they were moving in this direction?
Yeah, I think in a way, I mean, in terms of the regulation, like I said, that does give them certainty in terms of like, okay, what do we have to meet on this side of things? And then, what sort of incentives through the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, what's sort of going to help us to get there? Like, where sort of like the goodies at that make this transition a little bit easier? I think all of the events, the conferences and whatnot that I've attended in the last year, like the question has been brought up of like, again, how durable are certain EV related provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act? How durable are, the NEVI funds and whatnot? Like what, we've seen Republican opponents criticize those pieces of the legislation and whatnot. So I think, one of the things that, I've heard is just that the industry is heading in that direction. I think John Bozzella of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation has said it a ton that the future is electric. The auto industry is committed to electrification. We need all of these various things to go well and to be built out and whatnot to achieve, these big lofty goals. But that's the direction that we're heading in. And I know a lot of the automakers too have said, our investment decisions are not necessarily dependent on who is in office or what the makeup of Congress looks like. I think those factors obviously affect the pace of any sort of transition or transformation of the U.S. auto industry. But their sort of long-term commitments are pretty set.
Yeah, that the pace thing, that brings up another point. We see these dollars that are flowing in, but to get a sense of what the scale looks like, we do the estimates based on, again, projections. These are things that could happen to comply with the rule. We could see somewhere near, 10 and a half to 11 million EVs to be sold in the US in 2032. To give some context for what that actually means from a manufacturing standpoint in the country, or really in the market, the global market that serves the United States, that's a lot of factories that currently aren't operating. I toured the Fremont Tesla factory back in 2012, in the very early days of Tesla, and I saw the vast expanse of this place, which was really not even churning any vehicles out at that point, but you could see the possibility of it. Last year, they produced over 550,000 EVs in one shot in one location. We'd need about 19 of those in order to meet that production level, which is, a considerable expansion of that, of where we are today. And so, Chris, question to you is about, are we going to be able to do this? Are we going to be able to set all of the things up that actually can make this happen? It's not just going to be about the rule. To some extent, it's about what Audrey mentioned around IRA, vehicle incentives, NEVI, the infrastructure and funding, et cetera. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned IRA and NEVI, and those programs really set the table for a lot of this, giving the industry, building out the infrastructure, ensuring that there's a charger on, a nationwide network of chargers along all major travel pathways is huge. And all of the incentives, from battery production incentives to domestic supply chain incentives to consumer incentives to money for retrofitting factories, all of that stuff really sets the table for that massive investment jump that you illustrated earlier. And it's important to note that none of this is happening in a vacuum. There's as far as I know, there's not a single automaker that sells vehicles only in the United States. Every one of these automakers builds and sells automobiles for many, many markets around the world. And, all of those markets are electrifying rapidly, whether it's China, Europe, South America, all around the world, electric vehicles sales are growing. And these, all of the automakers need to compete, not just in the United States, but all around the world. So, what happens here matters. It matters a lot, but, it matters more about where those vehicles end up being built, whether they get built here in the United States or, we fall behind in other places around the world lead on electric vehicle sales, because the technology is marching along. The technology is improving every year. And so, yeah.
Yeah, this brings me to my last question, and that's really about what are we expecting to come next? We've got a lot of things now in place in the US to help, I think, set us up for some amount of success, or at least to catch up as to other countries, as Chris was alluding to. Do we think this rule's enough to actually put the administration on its path to its 2030 climate goals, at least from the transportation side? Is this all we should expect, from the Biden administration towards climate right now in transportation? So more things that we think might be coming. Is industry going to be very excited about this rule and just want to see it through, or are they going to try to start to pick apart at it, or at least some parts of the industry? We spent a lot of our time today talking about, what some might be calling the traditional automakers, the GMs of the world, et cetera. But Tesla and other all-electric vehicle manufacturers are out there, and they have lots of money too, and a lot at stake. So tell us a little bit about what you see as coming next, Audrey. We'll start with you.
Yeah, those are all great questions, Nick. And I think, some of the answers to that remain to be seen. Time will tell. I think in terms of the EPA, this EPA rule, it really is just one piece of the puzzle. Sort of going back to your Tesla Fremont slide, I think that's sort of a good example of why the auto industry has argued that they need a little bit more time in the lead up. And that's why we're seeing that sort of playing out in the final EPA rule. They've said that, the next 3 or 4 years are really critical, especially as we're moving away from early EV adopters. And, let's see the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law and everything sort of take effect, be implemented fully. Let's educate consumers on the technology, how it works for them, and also giving supply chains, all of those things, a chance to catch up. Because obviously, I think as we've talked before, the EV tax credits are pretty complicated, especially for accessing that credit for new vehicles, new EVs, just given some of the restrictions there for both automakers and for consumers to be able to qualify for a credit. So that's also kind of a piece that's influencing a lot of these supply chain shifts and challenges that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chris.
Yeah. So this EPA rule is very consistent with the Biden administration executive order back in 2021, where they called for 50% electric vehicles by 2030. We estimate that this rule will result in about 40% battery electric vehicles, 10% plug-in hybrids by that 2030 date. That date was consistent with automakers' commitments that they've made at, early in the Biden administration. And I think they made those commitments, thinking that they could hit those targets. And the auto industry is always going to complain and talk about how hard it's going to be and how difficult it's going to be when strong standards are on the table. They're never going to be like, this is going to be easy, give us stronger standards. They're always going to try and lobby for weaker standards. But what we know from the past is once the standards are in place, automakers tend to shift their tone. They put their heads down, they get to work, and historically they've delivered. And I don't expect this to be any different. Now that there's kind of a clear path, automakers, will put their heads down, innovate, and figure out how to do this.
Yeah, that last line about innovation just reminds me of some of the news stories I've been seeing lately about how the grid is not going to be prepared for EVs and the data centers and all the other things that we're trying to electrify across the society. I think they're forgetting that engineers are quite innovative people, and they're pretty good at solving problems, particularly when they have that certainty that you all are mentioning. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this episode. I really appreciate you both jumping on a Friday afternoon here in unseasonably cold DC. Hope those cherry blossoms will last the weekend. We'll see. But thanks again for joining me, Audrey and Chris. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And have a great weekend, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.